So here is something that should not be possible. On the 9th of April 1952, a woman who had been queen for 8 weeks signed a declaration that took her husband's name off his own children and put it out of his reach for good. On the 9th of April 2021, that same husband died at Windsor Castle, 2 months short of 100 years old, and this country spent the following week calling him by a name that had been handed to him rather than the one he was born under. 69 years apart, the same date on the calendar, and nobody inside that family has ever said one word about it in public. I went and checked it because that is the sort of thing I do. And both dates hold up. They sit underneath this entire story like a floor you cannot see. Quick word before we go further. I'm Harold. I spend my time going through everything that moves around this family, the declarations, the registers, the small entries that nobody reads twice, and what you are about to hear is me laying the pieces out in the order I found them. Stay with me to the end of this one because the last thing Princess Anne said out loud about her parents is the piece that reorganizes all the rest. And it does not mean what most people took it to mean. Let me tell you what you are getting today. The version of this marriage that goes round online is a fairy tale with one sad chapter at the end. A boy and a girl at a naval college in 1939, a wedding 73 years, and an old man who wanted a quiet farm. That version has been sanded down until there is nothing left on it to catch your hand. The real one has a document in it. It has a man who gave up his country, his church, his surname, and his titles inside the space of about a month, and who then spent the next decade finding out exactly how little that purchase had bought him. And it has one small object which he wore on his hand every single day for 77 years, and which almost nobody has ever looked at properly. Let me clear up the thing. Everybody gets wrong first because the rest of it depends on getting this right. You will have heard it said that Philip and Elizabeth never lived together at Buckingham Palace. That is not what happened. They moved into that building in 1952 together after her father died, and they lived in it for decades. Their children grew up in it. He had an office in it. He ran the estates from it. He modernized the kitchens in it. He put a television in the nursery and a bar in a room that had been sitting empty since the war. The true version, and it is far worse than the tidy rumor, has him fighting that move with everything he had. And he lost. And he went in anyway. And he stayed for the next 65 years in a house he had said out loud he did not want to enter. He got out in 2017 at the age of 96. Think about the shape of that for a second. A man argues against a house at 30. He is still in it at 96. And the first year he is legally free of every public duty he has. He packs and goes. That is not a whim about birdsong. That is a sentence finishing. Now the object. In December 1944, Philip's father died in a hotel room in Monte Carlo. Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark had spent the last stretch of his life more or less broke, living apart from his wife in the south of France. Philip was 23, serving in the Royal Navy, and he had not seen his father since before the war started. A set of trunks came back to him afterwards: clothes, a wooden shaving brush with an ivory handle, some papers, and a signet ring. That was the estate. That was the entire material inheritance of a man born a prince of 2 countries, handed to a son who was already at that point a person with no fixed address on earth. He put the ring on. He wore it for the rest of his life, through the wedding, through the coronation, through 70 years of state banquets and factory openings, and the 230-odd thousand hands he shook on duty. Go and look at photographs of him at 90. It is on the little finger of his left hand, worn thin, the crest on it almost rubbed flat. That ring is the only thing that man ever owned, which did not come to him through his wife. Hold that thought, because I am going to keep coming back to it, and by the time we get to a page signed in April 1952, you are going to understand why a piece of metal matters this much. Now let me go back to the beginning because the romance is real, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. The problem is that everybody stops telling it at the wedding, and the wedding is where the difficult part starts. They met properly in July 1939 at the Royal Naval College in Dartmouth. She was 13, he was 18, a cadet, tall, fair-haired, extremely good at the things 13-year-old girls notice, which in his case meant jumping the tennis nets and eating an alarming quantity of shrimp in front of an audience. Her governess wrote it down. Elizabeth watched him the whole visit and did not stop talking about him afterwards. They had crossed paths before that, at the 1934 wedding of his cousin, Princess Marina, to her uncle, the Duke of Kent. She was 8. Dartmouth is the one that counts. Then the war took him, and the letters started. And this is the part that gets photographed for the fairy tale and then put down before anybody asks the obvious question. Ask yourself where he was writing those letters from and where he was going when the leave came through, because he had nowhere. His father was in Monte Carlo and had effectively stepped out of his life. His mother, Princess Alice, had suffered a severe mental breakdown in the late 20s, spent years in sanatoriums, and by the war was in occupied Athens, sheltering a Jewish family in her apartment, an act for which Israel later honored her at Yad Vashem. His 4 sisters were all married and all living in Germany. His grandfather's throne had gone. The family had been put on a British warship and taken off Corfu when he was 18 months old, and he had crossed his first border in an orange box used as a cot. Philip spent his school holidays with relatives who had him as a favor and with school friends whose parents took pity. He had a trunk and a bicycle and an address that changed. And when a girl at Windsor started writing to him, the thing that arrived in his hands was not only a girl, it was the first fixed address he had been offered since he was a baby. I want you to hold both of those things at once, because the whole marriage runs on them, and everything that goes wrong in it later runs on them too. He loved her. Every person who was near them for 70 years says so, and they say it without being asked. He also had nothing else, and everybody in the room knew it. There is one more thing from those years, and it is the thing that follows him into every corridor in this story for the rest of his life. In November 1937, a plane came down in fog near Ostend in Belgium. Everybody on board died. Among them was Philip's sister Cecile, who was 26 and 8 months pregnant, her husband and 2 of their small sons. Philip was 16. He traveled to Darmstadt in Germany for the funeral. There is a photograph of that procession, and I would encourage you to go and find it because it explains more about the next 50 years of British royal history than any amount of commentary can. A boy in a dark overcoat walking behind his sister's coffin through a German town, flanked on both sides by uniformed men, and the uniforms are not neutral. Cecile's husband had joined the Nazi party, so had the men around them. That boy did not choose the marriages his sisters made. He was a child when they made them. He went on to serve in the Royal Navy for the entire war, was mentioned in dispatches at Cape Matapan, and was standing in Tokyo Bay for the Japanese surrender. None of that mattered because in 1946 and 1947, when the question of his marrying the heir to the British throne came up in the households and the clubs and the offices around this family, the photograph was the argument, not his war record. The funeral. That is the second inheritance he was carrying when he walked into Buckingham Palace to ask for her. A ring from a dead father, and a set of photographs he could never be rid of. Now watch what he was asked to pay. He gave up his Greek and Danish royal titles. He gave up his claim to the Greek throne. He converted from Greek Orthodoxy to the Church of England. He took British naturalization, and he took a surname because he did not have one, and the one selected for him was Mountbatten, the anglicized version of his mother's German family name, Battenberg, which had itself been changed during the First World War because Battenberg sounded wrong in Britain. Follow that all the way through and look at what it really is. A man born with no surname is given one that had already been invented for him by relatives to hide a different name that had become inconvenient in a previous war. He entered that marriage carrying a name that was itself a piece of public relations, and within 5 years, even that would be taken off him. The engagement was announced in July 1947. The ring he gave her had a 3-carat diamond in the center with smaller stones around it, and the stones came out of a tiara that had belonged to his mother. Alice had it broken up. She had nothing else to give, and she gave the last of it. That detail is real, and it is in every serious account of the engagement, and I keep coming back to it because it is the only moment in this entire story where somebody on his side of the family hands him something to give away rather than the other way round. They married on the 20th of November 1947 at Westminster Abbey. 2,000 guests, radio to 200 million people, and a bride who had to put ration coupons towards her own dress like everybody else. The morning of the wedding, the king made him Duke of Edinburgh, Earl of Merioneth, and Baron Greenwich. Note what is missing from that list because it turns up again later and it turns up in a way that stings. He was not made a prince of the United Kingdom. He had been born a prince of Greece and Denmark and had given that up, and the British version did not arrive with the wedding or the children or the accession. It arrived in 1957, 10 years later. Now his sisters, none of them were at that wedding. Not one. 3 of them were alive and well and would have come. And the decision was taken that German royalty 2 years after the war could not be photographed inside Westminster Abbey. Picture the scene properly, because this is the sort of thing that gets 3 words in a documentary, and it deserves more. 2,000 people in an abbey. Kings, queens, prime ministers, half the crowned heads of Europe, the bride's family filling one side of the building, and on the groom's side, one woman, his mother, in the gray habit of the religious order she had founded, sitting alone in a family pew with nobody either side of her. Every surviving member of his immediate family had been left off the list. He said nothing about it publicly, then or ever. Every man in that generation said nothing about everything. And this family in particular has raised silence to something close to a craft. And I want to be careful here because the exclusion made a kind of sense in 1947. And the people who made the decision were not monsters. 2 years after the camps were opened, you could not put a swastika in a wedding photograph. Understanding a decision and being on the receiving end of it are different jobs, though. And he had the second one, that is the marriage starting. A man with one relative in the building wearing a dead man's ring under a name that had been assembled for him by other people. And this next part is where the household starts working on him. So watch the small stuff, because the small stuff is the whole of it. Elizabeth's mother did not want the match. That is documented in every account of the period. And the reason was the German connection, and the nickname reported afterwards by more than one biographer is 1 syllable long, the Hun. Now, I cannot put a recording in front of you, and neither can anybody else. The record shows that the phrase has been reported by multiple people writing about that household, that nobody close to it has ever denied it, and that the woman it came from outlived him by 19 years and never once in public corrected the story. Think about how that operates day to day, because it is not a dramatic thing. It is the least dramatic thing in the world. It is a room, 12 people in it, drinks before dinner, and everybody in that room knows one word, and the word is never said in front of him, and it does not need to be, because he can see it going around the room in the pauses. He is the joke that is being politely not made. He is the only person present who has to be handled, and he was 26 years old. He had been shot at for 6 years for the country these people ran, and he had lost his sister and 4 members of her family in a field in Belgium. That is your humiliation, and there is no document for it. There is a man standing in a drawing room being the most correct person present, while a dozen people conduct an entire conversation over the top of his head about whether he counts. He took it. Every account says he took it for years without once giving them the satisfaction of a reaction. Then February 1952 happened, and everything he had been putting up with turned out to have been the easy part. Before I get to February 1952, I owe you the 2 good years because they existed, and leaving them out would make this a hatchet job. From 1949 to 1951, Philip was stationed in Malta with the Mediterranean fleet, and Elizabeth went out to join him. They rented a villa above Valletta. She had no engagements, no red boxes, and no household to speak of. She drove herself. She went to the hairdresser in the town like everybody else in the town. She sat in the stands and watched her husband play polo badly. He got his own command out there, a frigate. And by every account of that period, those months were the happiest of both their lives. People who knew them then describe a completely different woman, louder, quicker, somebody's wife in a country where nobody had asked her to be anything else. Now hold that picture in your head, because it is about to end in a single telephone call, and it never comes back. In February 1952, the 2 of them were in Kenya, standing in for her father on a Commonwealth tour because George V, 6th was too ill to travel. They spent a night at a place called Treetops, a lodge built into a fig tree over a watering hole watching elephants. Her father died in his sleep at Sandringham in the early hours of the 6th of February. The news reached the party in Kenya hours before it reached her, and the man who took it was Philip. His private secretary told him first out on the lawn away from the house. Every account of that morning uses the same description of what happened to him, and the description is not about grief. Mike Parker, the man who told him, said afterwards that he looked as though half the world had dropped on him. He walked her out into the garden and told her himself. They came back into the house about half an hour later. She sat down at her desk and started apologizing to people for wrecking the schedule. That is the last hour of that marriage, as it had been, because the machine arrived the following day and the machine had opinions. From that morning on, he walked behind her in every room at every arrival for the rest of his life. Her private secretaries reported to her. Her red boxes did not open for him. Her decisions went round him. He had commanded a warship at 29, and by 31 his job description was to be present, be silent, be 2 paces to the left. He never returned to the Navy. That career, the one thing in his life that had been entirely his own and entirely earned, closed on the 6th of February 1952 and never opened again. He was 30. He lived to 99. Think about that arithmetic for a moment, because I do not think most people ever have. He spent 69 years as a man who had been extremely good at something and was never allowed to do it again. And 30 years later, another outsider married into that same building and was handed the same set of instructions in the same tone of voice, and everybody in this country watched what it did to her. Diana was told where to walk, what to wear, when to speak, and when to stop. The people delivering those instructions were unfailingly polite, and the politeness was the worst part of it. And one of the very few members of that household who understood exactly what was happening to her had been through the identical process himself in 1952. Remember that it comes back at the end of this, and it comes back hard. Now the house. The two of them had spent 1949 to 1952 at Clarence House, and Philip had been all over that renovation. He had chosen fittings. He had argued about the plumbing. He had a workshop in it. It was the first building in his adult life that had anything of him in it at all. The accession meant Buckingham Palace, and everybody around them treated the move as automatic, the way you treat a tide. He fought it. He argued that Clarence House was a working home, that Buckingham Palace was an office block with beds in it, that the 775 rooms were a museum and a machine and no place to bring up 2 small children. He said that the palace was where the courtiers lived and that the courtiers were the problem. Everybody with a title in that building lined up against him. So did the government. They moved in May 1952. He lost in front of his wife, in front of the staff, and in front of a household that had already decided what he was. His mother-in-law then moved into Clarence House, which he had spent 3 years making habitable. I have gone round and round on whether he understood at that point what was happening to him, or whether he still thought each of these was a separate argument he might win the next one of. Watch what he does over the following 8 weeks, though, because a man who thought he was losing individual arguments does not do what he did next. He had one thing left. 1, he had been told what he could not do, where he could not live, what job he could not have, and which room he could not walk into first. He had not yet been told anything about his name, and in the spring of 1952, the name looked safe because the rule about it was not a rule at all. It was a custom. A married woman took her husband's name, the children took their father's name, and that had been true in this country for as long as anybody could point at. Nobody had needed to write it down because nobody had needed to ask. His children were Charles and Anne, 3 years old and 18 months old, and the surname on the paperwork, as far as he understood it, was going to be his. That is the thing he was holding when the trouble started, and the trouble started at a dinner party he was not at. One more detail about that move, because it is small enough to be missed, and it decides everything. The courtiers who ran Buckingham Palace in 1952 had run it for her father, and several of them had run it for her grandfather before that, and they regarded the Duke of Edinburgh as a young man with modern ideas who would settle down if he was managed properly. He wore some of them down over the following 30 years and got the kitchens and the accounts and a few of the ceremonies changed. Not one of them in any of those years ever treated him as anything other than a guest in a building his wife had inherited. Broadlands is a house in Hampshire that belonged to Lord Louis Mountbatten, Philip's uncle, and the single most ambitious man in 20th century British public life. Louis Mountbatten had spent his entire career pushing his family back up the ladder his own father had fallen off, and Philip was the instrument. He had steered the boy, arranged the introductions, handled the naturalization, supplied the surname, and stood in the Abbey in 1947 watching his nephew marry the future Queen of England. At a dinner at Broadlands in the weeks after the accession in front of guests, he said out loud that the House of Mountbatten now reigned. That sentence walked out of the dining room across 2 counties and into Marlborough House inside about a day. Marlborough House was where Queen Mary lived, Elizabeth's grandmother, and I want to be precise about this because the rumor online gets it backwards. So, she was no relation of Philip's at all in the direct sense. She was the widow of George V. She was 84. She had been born in Kensington Palace when Victoria was on the throne, and she had personally watched her husband change the family's name from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor in 1917 in the middle of a war with Germany to save the monarchy from a mob. She had seen a British royal house destroyed by a German surname once already in her own lifetime from the inside. The reaction was immediate, and it was reported afterwards in language that has stayed in the record because of how blunt it is. She wanted to know what on earth the Duke of Edinburgh thought the family name had to do with him. She did not go to her granddaughter. She went to the government. Her private secretary took it to Winston Churchill's private secretary, and Churchill took it to the cabinet, and the cabinet took a view. Understand what has now happened because the shape of it is the entire story. A dispute about a man's surname, which in any other household in this country is a conversation between 2 people in a kitchen, has been removed from the marriage entirely. It is now a matter for the Prime Minister. Philip has not been consulted. He has not been asked to attend anything, submit anything, or explain anything. Nobody has written to him. His name is being decided in a room he is not allowed into by men who have never discussed it with him. His wife was told the government's position, and the government's position was not a suggestion. On the 9th of April 1952, Elizabeth made a declaration in council. Let me explain what that is in 10 seconds because it decides everything after it. A declaration in council is the sovereign making a formal statement in front of the Privy Council, the body of senior advisers that has existed since the medieval period. And once it is made and minuted, it is not an opinion or a preference. It is the settled position of the Crown, and it stands until another one replaces it. The declaration said that she and her children would be known as the House and Family of Windsor, and that her descendants would carry the name Windsor. 1 page, 1 meeting, 8 weeks into her reign. His children were not going to have his name. Neither was the house. Neither was anything. And she signed it. She was 25 years old. She had been on the throne for 2 months. Her grandmother had lined up against her husband, and the Prime Minister had told her what the answer was. I do not think that woman had a way through it, and anybody who says she did has never looked at what a 25-year-old inherits in that job. She still signed it. That is what a document does. It removes the question of whether anybody wanted to. The line he said afterwards is the only time in 73 years that man ever let the public see the size of it, and he said it in private and it got out anyway. I am nothing but a bloody amoeba. He said, I am the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his own children. Read that second sentence again slowly because it is not self-pity and it is not a tantrum. It is a statement of fact. Every man in Britain in 1952, in every terraced house and pit village and semi in the country, had the automatic right he did not have. The dock worker had it. The prisoner had it. He was the single exception on the entire island. And the exception had been made specifically about him in writing by the state at the request of his wife's grandmother. That is the ugly part of this marriage. And there is one thing about it I want you to notice. There is no affair in it. There is no shouting match, no thrown object, no separation, no lawyer. Everything I have put in front of you so far is minuted, dated, and public. The damage in this marriage was done by paperwork, and it was done in the first 8 weeks, and both of them then lived on top of it for the next 69 years without ever once discussing it in public. Sit with the arithmetic on there. He was told in April 1952. He died in April 2022. Every anniversary they ever had, every christening, every wedding, every single time one of his children signed their own name in front of him, that page was underneath it, and it never came back up. There was no second declaration undoing it. There was no apology on the record. 30 years later, this same family took a 19-year-old girl and dressed her, briefed her, corrected her, and rebuilt her. And afterwards, a great many decent people said that nobody had meant her any harm and that everybody had done their best. The same thing was true in 1952. Nobody in that Privy Council meeting hated him. That is what makes it worse, not better. I said at the start that there was a small object in this story that mattered, and now you can see why. Every single thing that man had came through his wife or was taken from him by her household. The house was hers. The name was hers. The job was hers. The children carried her family's name by order of the crown. The signet ring on his left hand was the only object in his life that had come to him from his own blood, and it had arrived in a trunk from a hotel room in Monte Carlo with a shaving brush. He never took it off, not once in 77 years in any photograph anybody has ever found. Nobody has confirmed what that ring meant to him, and he never said. Watch what he does with the rest of his life, though, because a man makes his position clear in other ways. The 2nd of June, 1953, Westminster Abbey. 8,000 people inside the building and 27 million watching on television, which at that point was more people than had ever watched anything in this country's history. His wife was crowned. He was not. A Queen Regent's husband gets no crown, no throne, and no coronation of his own, and everybody involved knew that going in, and nobody had a problem with it. The part with teeth in it comes next. After the crowning, the homage begins. And the homage is the oldest piece of the ceremony in the building. The senior men of the realm come forward one at a time, kneel in front of the monarch, put their hands between the monarch's hands, and swear an oath. Philip went first, ahead of the archbishops, ahead of the dukes, ahead of every peer in England. He walked up the steps in his robes, took off his coronet, knelt down in front of his own wife on live television, and said the words, "I, Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, do become your liege man of life and limb and of earthly worship." Let me tell you what that phrase means, because it is the second and last piece of old language I'm going to explain today, and it is worth the 20 seconds. A liege man is a sworn subject. Life and limb means his body. Earthly worship means his standing in the world. The oath is medieval and it is not decorative. It hands over the person, the body, and the reputation of the man saying it, and it hands them to the person he is kneeling in front of. Then he stood up, touched the crown on her head, kissed her cheek, and walked backwards down the steps, because nobody turns their back on the sovereign. He was 32. He had been married to her for 5.5 years. I have watched that footage more times than is healthy. And I would ask you to go and watch it once. His face does not move. He does it perfectly because he was the best in that building at doing things perfectly. And that is your humiliation scene in front of 27 million people. And the extraordinary thing about it is that nobody watching thought of it as one. They thought it was rather moving. It was on the front of every newspaper the next day as a picture of devotion. A month and a half earlier to the week was the first anniversary of the declaration that had taken his name off his children. Now watch what happens over the next 4 years, because the household did not stop. He had given up being a Prince of Greece and Denmark in 1947. The British equivalent did not come with the wedding. It did not come with Charles being born, and it did not come with Anne, and it did not come with the accession, and it did not come with the coronation. The Duke of Edinburgh was not a prince of the United Kingdom. Foreign courts did not know what to do with him, and every man in that household with a stake in it knew perfectly well why the letters patent were not being issued, which was that his wife's mother and his wife's grandmother did not want them issued. Queen Mary died in March 1953. The Queen Mother went on for another half-century. The Princeton finally arrived in February 1957, 10 years after the wedding. And by then, it had stopped being a gift and had turned into something closer to an apology that arrives too late to be one. And in the same month, the whole thing broke into the open for the only time in 73 years. Philip had been away for 4 months on a long Commonwealth tour aboard the royal yacht. 4 months is a long time for a married couple in any circumstances, and the press worked out how long it was, and then the story went round the world in about 11 days. Rift at the palace, separate lives, marriage in trouble. Buckingham Palace did something in February 1957 that Buckingham Palace almost never does. It answered, the press office issued a flat public denial that there was any rift between the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh in writing on the record. Understand how far outside normal that is. That building's entire operating principle for a century has been that it does not comment, does not confirm, and does not deny on the theory that answering a story keeps it alive for another week. They broke the rule and they were telling the truth about the affair rumors as far as anybody has ever been able to establish, and they were also, by answering at all, telling the country that something in that marriage was worth defending in public. That is the moment this story stopped being private. 1957, the public got its first look at the shape of it, and the shape it saw was a man who was somewhere else. Then 3 years later, something moved. On the 8th of February 1960, Elizabeth issued an order in council declaring that her descendants, who did not carry a royal style, would use the surname Mountbatten-Windsor. She was pregnant with Andrew at the time. Some accounts say she had been unhappy about the 1952 position for years. Whatever drove it, the timing is a matter of record. And by then, Queen Mary was dead, and Churchill was out of office, and the two people who had forced the original page were no longer in the room. 8 years, that is how long it took to get his name into the record at all in a compound, applying to descendants who would not be royal. Charles was not covered by it. Anne was not covered by it. The two children who had been alive in April 1952, the two whose surname the whole fight had been about, kept Windsor. He got the principal. He did not get his children back. The first time that name appeared in public was on the 14th of November 1973, when Anne married Mark Phillips at Westminster Abbey and signed the register Anne Mountbatten-Windsor. Her father was standing about 6 feet away. His daughter, 23 years old, on her wedding day in front of 500 million people watching on television, put his mother's family name on a legal document for the first time in the history of this country. That is the closest thing to a victory in this entire story. And it took 26 years, and it happened because a young woman decided on her own to sign something a particular way. 8 years after that, on the 29th of July, 1981, a 19-year-old called Diana Spencer signed the register at St. Paul's Cathedral as the newest member of the same family, and Philip stood in the same position, 6 feet away, watching another outsider join an institution that had spent 30 years explaining to him what he was allowed to be called. Diana's marriage came apart in public across the early 90s, and the person inside that family who wrote to her about it was Philip. Those letters have been described by people who read them and by Diana's own circle, and they surprised everybody because the caricature of that man by then was a bad-tempered old sailor who said the wrong thing at factory openings. The letters were long. They were careful. They tried to understand what she was in the middle of. He signed them par. They also got harder as the years went on, and she carried on doing things he thought were destroying his son. And I am not going to pretend that correspondence was a warm bath from start to finish. He wrote them, though nobody else in that building did, and when the two of them fell out, the reason was one they both understood better than anybody else at that address, which is that both of them had walked in from outside and been told what they were allowed to be. Somebody left a comment under one of these videos a while back that I have not been able to shake since. They wrote that the royal family does not break the people who marry in. It declines to make room for them and then acts surprised at what happens next. Two people in that generation could have testified to that, and one of them died in 1997. The first week of September 1997, in the days between the crash and the funeral, the family was at Balmoral, and the question on the table was whether two boys should walk behind their mother's coffin through central London in front of 1 million people. Charles wanted them to, others did not. The boys were 15 and 12. The man who settled it was their grandfather, and the way he settled it has been reported the same way from several directions. He told William that if he did not walk, he thought he would regret it later. Then he said the part that ended the argument, "If I walk, will you walk with me?" He was 76 years old. He was not obliged to be anywhere in that procession, and he put himself in it so that a 15-year-old would not have to be the only one. Look at that man's whole life, and then look at that sentence. A boy with no country, no home, and no name of his own is offered the same treatment by the household he married into, takes it for 45 years, and then at 76 walks a mile through London beside somebody else's 15-year-old. So the boy is not standing there alone. Nobody in that family did more for those two boys that week, and he never once mentioned it afterwards. Now the ending. In May 2017, Buckingham Palace announced that the Duke of Edinburgh would stop carrying out public engagements from that August. He was 95. His final solo engagement was a parade of Royal Marines in the rain in the forecourt at Buckingham Palace, and he stood in it without a coat. Then he went to Wood Farm. Wood Farm sits on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk. 5 bedrooms, none of them grand, a kitchen you can heat with the door shut, a view of a field, staff of 2 or 3. He took his books, his easel, his letters, and a great deal of correspondence about carriage driving, and he told people more than once that he was doing what he wanted with what was left, which he put it not very much. The Queen came at weekends. She had 4 years of running the country from Windsor, while her husband lived in a farmhouse 100 miles away, and the pair of them wrote and telephoned constantly, and every single person who saw them together in those years describes 2 people who were fine. That is the shape everybody argues about online. He left, she stayed. And the argument has always been about whether he left out of spite, and the country would not leave it alone. From the moment he went to Norfolk, one theory ran in the papers and ran a great deal harder online. He had waited. He had put in the 65 years and the engagements and the handshakes, and the day the last obligation lifted, he had walked out of her house to make a point that could not be answered. By 2021, that version had won, and people were repeating it as established fact underneath footage of the man's own funeral. He died at Windsor on the 9th of April 2021, aged 99, with his wife at the castle 69 years to the day after the page that took his name off his children. They buried him at St. George's Chapel on the 17th of April. And the country got one photograph out of it that did more work than every word written that week. 30 people in a chapel built for 800. Rules on gatherings still in force. And a woman of 94 in black sitting entirely alone in a stall, 4 millers of empty stone on either side of her at her husband of 73 years' funeral. That image ran on the front of every newspaper in the world the next morning, and it settled the argument for a great many people who had spent 4 years insisting the marriage had failed. And now I owe you the thing I held back at the start. That autumn, ITV broadcast a documentary in which his children talked about him, and Anne and Edward sat down together for it, and the interviewer put the question to them directly, the spite question. Did your father go to Norfolk to make a point? Anne is the one who answered it, and she is the one who had been closest to him, and she had to stop partway through. Her answer was that he got older, and he wanted somewhere he could walk around a farm without a million people trying to shake his hand. Every headline the next morning called that a denial, and it is one. Almost nobody noticed the next part, and it is the reason I have kept you here for the last half hour. Anne is the most disciplined public speaker in that family. That woman has spent 50 years declining to answer things. She does not take bait. She does not expand. And she has ended more interviews with 4 words than any other royal alive. She chose to answer that one. You do not deny a rumor that nobody is repeating. You deny the one that has got loud enough to worry you. And the fact that the Princess Royal sat down in 2021 and specifically knocked down the idea that her father had left her mother out of spite tells you exactly how many people had come to believe it, including, I would guess, some of them at that address, and read the actual sentence rather than the headline. He wanted somewhere nobody was watching him. He wanted somewhere he could walk around a field and not be handled. 96 years old. 70 years inside that institution, 22,000 handshakes, a war, a shipping career he was made to give up at 30, an oath sworn on his knees in front of his own wife, and a page in 1952 that took his surname off his son and daughter and never gave it back. And the thing his favorite child had to explain to the country on television after he died is that all he had wanted at the end was a field where nobody could see him. That is the marriage. There is no mistress in it and no screaming row that got out. There is a woman who signed what she was told to sign in the 8th week of her reign, a household that made a man audition for 50 years for a place he had already paid for, and a man who took all of it standing up, and then at 96 walked out of the building the first day. Nobody could stop him. Tell me below whether you think he forgave that page, because I have gone back and forth on it for weeks and I am still not settled. And subscribe if you want the rest of these, because the 1960 order has a second half to it that almost nobody has read, and that is the next one. He gave up a throne, a church, a country, and a surname to marry her, and the family he gave them up for spent the next 69 years making certain his name never touched a single one of his children. Then they put him in the vault at St. George's under theirs.